Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Hannah Borowski, and I'm a junior here at the college and a member of Divest Harvard. Today's forum represents an exciting opportunity for real and meaningful discussion on fossil fuel divestment and Harvard's role in addressing climate change. As defined by a recent study out of Oxford, divestment is a socially motivated activity of private wealth owners, such as university endowments, to withhold their capital from companies seen to be engaging in a reprehensible activity. The campaign for fossil fuel divestment at Harvard began last fall. The movement has since spread to 400 colleges and universities, as well as cities, churches, and other organizations. Last fall, Harvard undergraduates voted in favor of fossil fuel divestment on a referendum in the UC election. Then, members of Divest Harvard began meeting with two members of the Corporation Committee on Social Responsibility, or the CCSR, which is an advisory committee to the Harvard Management Corporation. The corporation has maintained a strong presumption against divestment, as has the university president, Drew Faust. On the handout that you've received is a recent statement issued by President Faust on fossil fuel divestment, as well as Divest Harvard's response. Alumni and students organizing for Divest Harvard requested that President Faust discuss divestment with the community in a public forum. Unfortunately, President Faust was unwilling to discuss divestment with us today, but we are very honored and excited to have such an amazing panel of faculty and students willing to productively engage in a discussion on the pros and cons of divestment. So without further ado, let me introduce Tara Ragomir, UC President, and your moderator for today's event.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to Divest Harvard for having me. It's quite an honor to be up here with such amazing panelists. Also, thank you to all of you for coming out to this really important event. Like Hannah said, we've been talking about divestment on campus for over a year now, and now a lot of the nation is talking about divestment from fossil fuels as well. And what an exciting opportunity to hear all sides of the debate about divestment and about divestment in the broader scheme of climate change activism. Also, a thank you to Jamila Pettagini, our new University Vice President for Sustainable Investment, who's also with us today. I'm sure Jamila will be eager to engage in the dialogue as our discussion this afternoon continues. So, with no further ado, I want to introduce today's panelists. Unfortunately, Professor John Coates could not be with us today because of a family emergency, but we still have an amazing panel. I'll start with Rebecca Henderson, who's closest to me. Professor Rebecca Henderson is the John and Natty MacArthur University Professor at Harvard University, where she has a joint appointment at the Harvard Business School in the General Management and Strategy units, and is the co-director of the Business and Environment Initiative. She's also a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Her work explores how organizations respond to large-scale technological shifts, most recently in regard to energy and the environment. She teaches innovation in business, energy, and environment and reimagining capitalism in the MBA program. Next to her is Professor Jim Engel. James Engel is the Gurney Professor of English and Professor of Comparative Literature. He's also a member of the Committee on Degrees in the Program of History and Literature and a faculty associate of the Harvard University Center for the Environment. He teaches courses in Romantic Poetry, 18th Century Studies, and Rhetoric. For the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, he has taught a course on American environmental history and its pertinence for environmental issues today. He has lectured on environmental education in the US, Japan, and China. Next to Professor Engel, we have Tim DeChristopher. Tim is an environmental activist and founder of Peaceful Uprising, an organization dedicated to creating livable futures and empowering nonviolent action. Today, Tim is well known for an act of civil disobedience in which he disrupted a government oil and gas lease auction by posing as a bidder and dramatically increasing the bidding prices on the land. Ultimately, Tim was sentenced to 2 years in prison for his involvement in the auction. Tim has become an iconic figure in the environmental movement, and his story has been heavily featured in the media, including in a documentary about him entitled Bidder 70. He is now a student at Harvard's Divinity School. And finally, we have Professor Dan Schrag. Dan Schrag is the Sturgis Hooper Professor of Geology at Harvard University, Professor of Environmental Science and Engineering, and Director of the Harvard University Center of the Environment. He studies climate change over the brightest range of Earth history. He is particularly interested in how information on climate change from the geologic past can lead to a better understanding of anthropogenic climate change in the future. In addition to his work on geochemistry and climatology, Shrek studies energy technology and policy, including carbon capture and storage and low-carbon synthetic fuels. Shrek currently serves on President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. What an incredible panel, right? So, with no further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'll talk to you a little bit about the format of today's discussion. We really want this to be as discussion-based as possible, so we're going to start out with a few pre-prepared questions for the panelists and go in order. But at any point after someone has said something, if you have a follow-up question or you want to jump in with a thought of yours, just signal to me somehow and we'll try to integrate you in the conversation as best as possible. Once we get through these pre-prepared questions, then we'll just open the floor to the audience to have a nice open dialogue with the panelists and with each other. Also, if you have any interest in tweeting about today's event, you can tweet at Divest Harvard, and all of our tweets will be centralized in the nice way that the internet does that these days. So, let's start with the first question. The first question is, how should Harvard respond to global climate change? And why don't we start with Professor Henderson right over here.
And I have a minute. How should Harvard respond to global climate change? So Harvard should say in many forums and many ways that climate change is real and anthropogenic. We should have, as we do, in fact, a full suite of courses addressing these issues. We should be encouraging everyone on campus to understand the basic science, understand the possible solutions. I believe we should be encouraging everyone on campus to be politically engaged. I think it's very important that we keep in mind that the fundamental short-term solutions at least have to be political, and this campus should be politically intensely aware of that. I think we should be training people to make a difference in their jobs and careers and role as citizens after they leave, so that it's very clear you stop being a student at Harvard doesn't mean you stop being really engaged with this issue. I think this is the issue for our time, and it should be one of the central themes of the campus experience.
Okay, thank you. Professor Engel.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to take just 15 seconds and say something which I think is important. I know no conflict of interest that I have with regard to this topic. I've never been employed by a fossil fuel company. I don't plan to be. I don't have any financial interest of any kind in this debate. I think that is important to state in this kind of forum. I agree with everything Professor Henderson said. Everything. I'd like to add one thing to it. The purpose of a liberal education in the arts and sciences is ultimately action. There is an ethical and moral dimension to the climate issue. It's an important one. Politics are not amoral. Occasionally they're unethical, but they should be ethical. I believe it's impossible to separate out issues of actual ethical stances from the climate change question. If we do that, we're taking away the entire issue of environmental ethics and the values by which we live by. Our habits are values in disguise. Our investments are values. Thank you.
Thank you. Since you say it's important to point out, I guess I should also point out that I have no conflicts of interest in this, and that I am not employed by the fossil fuel industry. Have very little chance of ever being so.
Just wait.
I also agree with Professor Henderson about the fundamental role for Harvard in engaging with the climate crisis. But I would say that when obstacles are encountered in that, those obstacles have to be addressed. That yes, the fundamental role of the university is research and teaching. But when there is a force that's standing in the way of the implementation of that research, that has to be addressed. And I think anyone who's seriously paid attention to what's been going on with climate change over the past few decades has to come to the conclusion that there is a major obstacle, which is the political power of the fossil fuel industry. To say that this is just going to be solved by scientists and we just need to keep doing more research, I think is actually disrespectful of the great research that scientists have done. That when it comes to the climate crisis, scientists have been the people doing their jobs. They've done the research and pointed out what the problem is. They've done a lot of research and created a lot of solutions that could be implemented today. But that's not happening because the fossil fuel industry is muddying the water with that science, intentionally spreading disinformation, and preventing the implementation of solutions. So in that case, I think the university has a responsibility to address that roadblock to their fundamental work. That there's an incredibly powerful force in this country that is preventing this university from doing their fundamental job of research and education, that is intentionally standing in the way of that. And that force has to be addressed. And I think the university needs to separate its funding from that industry in order to show the world that industry is fundamentally opposed to the work that Harvard is doing, which is veritas. The industry of fossil fuels is fundamentally opposed to that work. So that's why I'm in favor of divestment.
And Professor Schreck?
Thank you. I mean, well, lots already been said. I guess in terms of what Harvard should be doing, I of course agree with Rebecca and Jim, and I think there's more we could actually be doing on the education front. I would someday like to see every student at Harvard be required to take at least one course on the subject of climate and energy. We are very far away from that right now. Right now, we couldn't actually handle it if we actually were to require that because we don't have the courses in the books yet. I am working really hard to increase enrollment and ease our way into that 5 years from now. I'd have to have all my colleagues agree that this would actually become a requirement, probably for undergraduates. In the gen ed, you could imagine it being part of the gen ed requirement. We're not there yet. We couldn't even propose this yet because, again, we don't have the courses, we don't have the numbers, but I'd love to see us get there 5 years from now. On the research side, you know, I completely agree with you, Tim, that we shouldn't just say, oh, this is a research issue, you know, this is up to scientists to go do research about this issue. That's not going to solve this problem. Nobody thinks that. And it's not up to engineers to go invent better widgets to solve this problem on its own either. This is intensely political, it's about economics, et cetera. And you're right, there's been a lot of lying. By the way, there's been lying on both sides, unfortunately. The truth is, though, that this is a very difficult issue. This is going to take a long time to solve. And there's some reasons that some of my students have been stewing on just today in my class on this issue, why it's so difficult. Part of it is the infrastructure is massive. Part of it is, you know, economics and choice. People don't want to give up the convenience of fossil fuels. We all depend on it. All of our modern lives depend on it. And we don't want to just stop using it. We have to face that. And so, you know, I think of Walt Kelly's famous Pogo cartoons from the 40s, and you know, where Pogo says, "We've seen the enemy and he is us." That's partly truth here, which is we're part of the problem. We're going to talk about this now, I guess, over the next hour, but the way I feel about this is that I strongly support what all of the students in the divestment campaign are trying to do. And at the same time, I actually support what Divest is doing as well. And that sounds like it's a conflict, but I'll try to explain. I actually think it's perfectly consistent. And I'll try to explain that.
So on that note, Professors Henderson and Engel, you didn't actually mention divestment in your answers. Do you see divestment playing a role in Harvard's response to climate change?
Thank you for asking. And Jim, I think you raise a good point. So I should be clear that I have worked for a fossil fuel company. I did a big project for one of the large oil and gas companies about 7 years ago. And a bunch of my students go and work for oil and gas companies. So I don't feel like I have an immediate financial interest, but I am, you know, engaged. And I think the point that Dan raises, which we're actually all deeply complicit. So let me answer your question here. So I am unbelievably sympathetic with the emotional energy that drives the divestment campaign. I believe that we are frying the planet, that we are betraying our children and our grandchildren, that we are destroying other species, and that this is completely unacceptable. So I absolutely agree there's a deep moral issue here. For me, the question is, so what do we do about it? What is to be done? And I think it's important, for me at least, to bear in mind that, for me, the single biggest thing that would make the difference is, as I said, is political action. Our big problem is we have half the Republican Senate that doesn't think that global warming is even happening, let alone should they respond. So I think it's important to bear in mind that the end state we're trying to reach is, I think, an aroused citizenry that is demanding action on this front. That without that kind of action, we're nowhere. So then the question is, what is Harvard's role in supporting that action? As I said, I think education on the campus, preparing people for careers in this area, raising political awareness. I think we should all be routinely going down to DC and making a fuss about this. I think we should be in the local state house. I think we should be talking to our friends. The question is divestment an appropriate way forward here? And what do I feel about divestment? So, first, one of the things that worries me about divestment is it sort of makes it over there. You know, it's evil fossil fuel companies. And Tim, you put it very well. And I think certainly some of the fossil fuel companies have been well documented, behaved appallingly. We know that Exxon spent heavily to promote global warming denialism, and I think that's terrible. Firms actively trying to subvert truth and subvert democracy in so doing. So the question is, is divestment the problem? Here's where I get stuck. We use fossil fuels all the time. Who in here eats meat? Who flies? Who heats their houses? Who uses aluminium? Who uses cement? It's all crystallized fossil fuels. It's not like it's out there. Why do the fossil fuel companies behave as they do? They do because they're trying to make money, because that's what the rules are. Now, as I said, I think there are some actions which are unacceptable, and I want to come back to those. But in the general run of things, a fossil fuel company is giving people what they say they want at a price they say they want. And to pick up Dan's point, we're going to need oil and gas at least for many years, unfortunately. And we're going to need the capabilities of these firms in order to transition the economic system. So I have students who I think you would really like, who are passionate about these issues, who've gone to work for Shell and BP and energy companies of all kinds, trying to understand how do we transition to biofuels, how do we build a new grid that can handle some of the renewables, how do we make this transition happen? So what are we trying to do with divestment? Well, we could be trying to hurt the fossil fuel companies, but we're not really going to do that. Not in any immediate sense, because it's not going to affect the price of the stock. We're trying to make like a moral statement. What is the moral statement? Fossil fuel companies are bad, using fossil fuels is bad. What are we trying to say here? Where are we trying to go? Is this the most effective statement to make? If we're going to make that statement, are we also going to divest from the firms that are fishing out the oceans, cutting down the trees, employing really nasty labor practices? Do you know where your clothes were made? Do you know where your shoes were made? The whole system is producing horrible side effects. This is our problem. It is the problem for our time, I think. So I can understand why the corporation is nervous, right? Well, if we divest oil and gas, A, we need the companies. B, well, how about McDonald's anyway? You know, all that beef, if you start looking at the environmental implications of beef, it's a problem. So I'm very uncomfortable with the sort of, let's just take the fossil fuel companies and just cut them out. What I would propose instead is the following. If I were the president, what I think I would recommend. I would recommend strong and aggressive screening for the portfolio. It's quite common. Many large financial institutions are already using this. So let us be very precise about those firms that are inappropriately attempting to influence the democratic process, for example. Let's insist on full transparency, who are you funding and why. Let's sit down with firms we have reason to believe are actively funding global warming denialism. Let's say that's not okay. Let's signal that we're very uncomfortable with that behavior. Let's screen, and not just fossil fuels. I'm really serious about this fishing out the oceans and cutting down the trees and mistreating people badly. Let's make sure that we hold firms to at least best practice local wages and global standards. And then the other thing I would say is, okay, I'm really uncomfortable with coal. Coal companies make me nervous. You know, coal kills tens of thousands of people every year, horrible health effects. They've mountaintop removed over 500 mountains, very nasty environmental consequences. Major contributor to global warming, as I'm sure everyone in here knows. If we're going to solve this problem, our first stop has to be coal and taking coal out of the energy mix. So I would at the very least start sitting down with the coal companies, how they're addressing these issues. I think it has to be a powerful argument to at least persuade me that we should continue to hold coal in the portfolio. I'm very uncomfortable about the idea that our research and teaching might be being partly financed with earnings derived from coal. But that's because I have that particular bright line. But I think the broader bright line is too general for me, and it's too much over there. It too much lets us off the hook. We should be acting right now in so many ways. We can't just say it's the bad companies, it's not us, it is us. And we should take responsibility.